Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Azumanga Daioh of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Varg Vikernes Rizzed Up Baby Grunk.
What does that mean?
It's a long story. It belongs on the internet. It belongs in a museum.
and I am the black metal guy, aka Singaporean Shell Company Explosion.
That's there's so many possibilities unfurl from there. Okay, so we got an episode for you. This is going to be Terminus Lite. The black metal guy is out for a trip right now, so our time's a little bit limited. We've started playing a little bit with the contours of these episodes. You know, we've been doing some longer stuff recently, some shorter stuff. We're just kind of bouncing around based off what there is to talk about and what the circumstances are. Because if there was anything Terminus had an excess of, it was consistency and stability in scheduling and format. So, did you have anything?
Though, considering the sheer amount of content we put out, I'd say we're pretty consistent.
Yeah, that is fair. We put a lot out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and every time we do this, we always big up ourselves talking about how much we put out there. You can tell how good we are based on how much we talk about it. We're saints, really.
Yeah. Everyone says so, right? The biggest.
the biggest metal podcast, the most beautiful one. All right, so we just got a couple records to talk about today, but obviously not music related, but has to be mentioned. Rest in power to Uncles Ted Kaczynski and Cormac McCarthy, dying within a week of each other, and I feel like it goes without saying that both of those figures are just inherently Terminus things that our listener base are especially fixated on. So, yeah, just wanted to give the shout out and the moment of not silence, but I'll do what I did the last time we did a memorial thing. I will play Anal Cunt's 40 Reasons to Hate Us sped up for 5 seconds. Thank you. I think that both of those men would appreciate that as a tribute.
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
All right, guys. It's been a little bit since I've last tortured you with a really extreme, brutal death record. So before you immediately shoot to the second half of our episode, let me promise you, this is a really cool one because it sounds like falling down the stairs for half an hour, but it's like a crazy MC Escher set of stairs. This is the second self-titled full-length by Cadavoracity. This is an independent digital release, and it's also seems to be coming out on Earsturbation Records, which is like a newer brutal death label, I believe. Cadavoracity was not a band that I was familiar with before I encountered this record. They are an Indonesian kind of grinding, brutal death metal band, but I got turned on to it because Polwok from Thailand is the current drummer. We covered him on my mini review of the Smallpox Aroma record that just came out. He's almost without question probably top 5 drummers in metal, period, in the world right now. And he is used to his fullest on this record. So not being familiar with Cadavoracity prior, I didn't really know what to expect, although I got kind of clued in by the really cool abstract cover art, which is just this sort of rotating red and black smear, but you can see like hands and claws or maybe faces in the detailing. It's very strange. It strikes me a lot as being something like Incenithrak would use, which makes sense because this band actually sounds a fair amount like Incenithrak. This is hyper brutal death metal, definitely cut from the sort of New Standard Elite vein, clearly influenced by stuff like Enmity and I think, probably Incenithrak directly. It is extremely technical, extremely fast, and extremely withering, but unlike a lot of the brutal death that we've covered, that we'd use those adjectives for, this feels different in that it's extremely liquid and organic. It's not as mechanical as a lot of the stuff that we like to cover on the show. And I just really fell in love with this thing because it's just, in terms of sheer, extremity arms race, this has to be carving out a niche of its own, at least in terms of sheer aggression. So with that being said, as usual, let's kick it over to the black metal guy. What did you think about this latest sojourn into the darkest realms?
Well, I think it's like it's funny you say we don't usually cover the more, or we cover the more mechanical stuff normally, but that's your taste, right? I tend to prefer the stuff that has a bit more of an organic streaming sound, right? So this is right up my alley. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I suppose really that just puts it at a little bit of a distance from a lot of other brutal death stuff, which leans towards that more mechanistic production and performance. Someone in the comments is saying, "Oh, now this is really brutal, right?" It sounds like Antediluvian and Impetuous Ritual, who we reviewed like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So this is, I definitely think this is very cool, and it is much closer to war metal in the same way that something like, it's much closer to Impetuous Ritual war metal. It also sounds a lot like if you took Antediluvian songs, sped them up 4 times, and added more palm mutes, which, I mean, pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think this is a really great time to discuss the relationship between those styles, because, I mean, that's a thing that really you and I have repeatedly said about some of the modern war metal stuff, which is that, in a big sense, it sounds like brutal death already. We were commenting on that when we covered the latest Impetuous Ritual record, which just has sort of direct brutal death technique, but isn't perceived in that way. And now we have a brutal death band that is clearly very deliberately courting the same sort of aesthetic values, but coming from brutal death metal directly. And it's very interesting to me to see sort of the same fundamental musical techniques perceived in completely different ways by different sections of the metal audience.
I guess also the common root for brutal death and war metal, right? Despite the other very different influences, would be grindcore.
Yeah,
and this is certainly a record that is just like one long grind. It's the sheer density of it and lack of breathing space is astonishing. There basically are almost no parts to hook your ears into, and it's almost all blast beats.
Yeah. So. But it's kind of amazing how many different kinds of blast beats he manages to do.
For sure. That's the Polak thing. Yeah, there's tons of different tempos and inflections, and I guess just rhythmic variation in the blasting for sure.
Yeah, I think that there's a very solid chance that this is probably directly inspired by stuff like Impetuous Ritual and Grave Upheaval. And then you combine some of those aesthetic values with more of like a Last Days of Humanity technical presentation, and you end up with something really interesting. We've talked a lot about the idea of these sort of high art brutal death records. And, this is the latest in a series of them that really makes a substantial argument for this being a sort of abstract art music. So it's kind of hard to go any further without showing people what this sounds like. So we're going to be a little bit different on samples this time. I'm just going to play a full song, and then the black metal guy has some things that he wants to point out later. Because I think that, like, it's important to hear one of these compositions in full. This can't really be sampled. I mean, this is an album made of extremely homogeneous material, and deliberately so. But I think it's important to be able to see the edges of it, where it begins and ends, and sort of how these songs contort and flow in and out of themselves in this really exciting and novel way. So I'm going to go to a track called, this is me almost certainly butchering Javanese, forgive me, Utepi Basu Napistum. So let's just listen to that.
Wait, were you saying butchering what?
Javanese. These guys are from
think this
West
is
Java.
Sumerian.
Oh, is it? Oh, yeah, I would have no idea. I mean, it could totally be plausibly either to me.
Well, track 5 is called Pardzilu Anunnaki.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that could be
or
something.
like, the Anunnaki, right? The other track titles like Ina La Umisu Emuk with a UC or UK. UQ, gosh, I'm retarded right now. I think it might all be in Sumerian, but who the fuck knows?
Yeah, no, that is extremely plausible. Both of those are very plausible to me, so I'll go with Sumerian in that case. So let's listen to.
Well, guys, we've narrowed it down. It's either Indonesian or ancient Sumerian.
Yeah, I mean, they're sister languages, basically. It's like it's like Spanish and Italian. So let's listen to Utepi Basu Napistum. We're just going to listen to this whole track, and then we'll start to dig into some of the aesthetic values here. Okay, so I want to say a couple things. One, I am, as is pretty obvious, a seasoned Brutal Death listener, and I still think this is, like, possibly one of the most intense things I've ever heard. There's something about the way this band moves. I don't know if it's just, like, the sheer speed. I mean, I'm thinking that the vast majority of this record has to be well above the 300 BPM mark. I know the Polwalk is able to blast somewhere toward 340, and it sounds like they're engineering the fucking record around that ability. This whole album, just for a half hour, has some of the most witheringly intense stuff I've ever experienced. And probably a lot of that owes to the production, which is just like a granite wall exploding. It's so loud and redlined, but it's got enough depth of timbre to make you want to turn it up even louder. Like, clearly the ideal way to experience this album is out of a massive set of speakers at the pain threshold. And it's interesting that listening to this, we're not even, like, really I'm not even really touching on, like, technical performances or songwriting here, because this is really sort of first and foremost a weird atmospheric piece, I think. What's going on instrumentally is, like, almost incalculable just because it's moving so quickly. And a sort of time dilation occurs. You start just thinking about it in terms of, like, these broad movements of riffs. You know, it's like, it's the fastest thing in the world, but you listen to it like it's Funeral Doom. At least I do.
The parts that you latch onto really are the transitions or the dropouts, things like that. There is... I know what you mean about it being built around speed. It frequently outruns the listener.
Oh yeah, yeah.
If you try to pay attention to the riffing, it will meep and leave you in the dust.
Yeah, it's because the riffs has giant quotation marks around it. I think there's a good chance that, like in Senethrock, a lot of this is improv or something like improv, because I believe that this record was recorded with all the musicians remote from each other, and I would assume that it was written like that as well. So there's a quality of, like, it's equally possible that any of these songs started with just an isolated drum track or a guitar track or a vocal track, and other people just sort of exquisite corpse style added their input, and it was basically left untouched from there.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of goes with that idea that we haven't talked about it recently, but that idea that a lot of Brutal Death is now operating more like jazz sessions than bands, you know? It's like individual guys participating in all sorts of groups that aren't necessarily intended to function like bands typically do in metal.
And this would be a little different because if it's a distance project, then it's kind of the opposite of a jazz combo. But you still have every artist puts in... But in a way, it makes it even more literal, right? It's every artist just puts in his voice, and that's the final product.
Yeah. It's
interesting, because I would have assumed this was performed live. It's so intense. And that might have something to do with the improv that goes into it.
Yeah, I could see a lot of these starting as just a guitar or a drum track. I mean, I've seen Polwalk just improv in videos before, and he's fully capable of, you know, creating a 3-minute drum-only composition that really hangs together as a song, even when delivered at this sort of speed and technicality. I think that, really, like, the thing that I have to keep coming back to, it's almost impossible to pick apart individual songwriting moments just because of the sheer intensity of what's going on. But as a result, you have arrived at a similar place to bands like Impetuous Ritual or Antediluvian at their most aggressive. And I think that that's really sort of a fascinating quality in and of itself for this band. You know, approaching it from a radically different mindset, but arriving at the same destination.
It hits you with a challenge, kind of like, could you process it all?
Yeah, I've kind of talked about that, where it's like certain kinds of brutal death like requires you to like prepare for it, you know, to like work your way up.
It's definitely true that as a kid or whatever, right? You know, when you first hear something like Converge, it's kind of you don't really know how it's all being done. It's incredibly extreme. There are parts that will just sound like vom, 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 vom. Mm-hmm. But I guess it's true that even then there was stuff that I immediately could get my hooks in, and that was immediately appealing about it. Mm-hmm. And this is, I mean, at this point, I find this immediately appealing because it just sounds like fucking noise. But like there is, you wonder, like, is this one of these kinds of things I can learn to parse by listening to it, or not? And the fact that for you, this still, because you're so much more used to this style, this also just sounds like noise, is pretty crazy. Like,
oh yeah,
there's enough of it there. There's enough of it there that one wants to really process it, but you just can't.
Yeah, it's like I think it was Jesus Christ on the Metal Archives described Enmity's record as being almost like a magic eye picture. Mm-hmm. Where you have to sort of unfocus and then the actual image reveals itself to you. So Cadavoracity is interesting because I think it is meant to be listened to almost in a sort of meditative state. Like when I get to stuff, when you get to stuff that's like at the speed of Orchidectomy or later bands, it's like it ceases to function in the way that quote-unquote more normal brutal death does. And the Cadavoracity record really sort of comes off as just the most high-intensity ambient record of all time, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It's exquisite. But you had a track that you wanted to point something out on, right?
Yeah. Well, here's the kind of thing you can latch onto. Often when you get moments that sound like the clearest moments are often dropouts and things that sound like pre-mosh breaks in a beatdown song or something. And those are moments where things get a little less dense and you can latch onto some repeated rhythmic figures. And usually the thing that happens after it actually is something like a breakdown, but it's just happening 4 times as fast. So let's listen to La Sanan Abanascopatu, and we're going to start at about 110, 109, and in going into one of these dropout parts.
Holy fuck. Jesus.
Yeah. I love how it ends, right? It sort of stutters, and then the blast beat just keeps going, right? Pollock insists.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like it's almost like they know that by like just gesturing at the breakdown, like that has enough weight. It's like they don't even need to show you what the thing would be. It's just like insert it mentally for yourself, you know?
Yeah. Well, from about 120 to 150, right? You get we get like two real quick stammer dropout moments at the very beginning of the sample. One comes in really quick, one right after it. And those punctuate it. And then at about, I don't know, 120 or 130, about 20 minutes, 20 seconds into that sample, you get like a more clearly marked dropout section, and then you actually do get a 6/8 chug break. It's
actually, almost like music.
Yeah, you get something that sounds like a bolt thrower part or something.
Mm-hmm.
But then very quickly, right? It's that feeling of the music outracing your ear. Just when you're processing it and starting to groove, it just hurtles back into blasts. Not really in a spazzy way, it just accelerates. It's like somebody flooring it in a car that has extremely fast acceleration, right? It happens smoothly, just ridiculously fast.
Yeah, it's it's hard to overstate the sheer technical skill on display here from everybody, from what we can parse of the riffs on this record. But obviously, Pollock's performance is insane.
2/3 of the way through the track, you start to hear some death metal riffs.
Ooh, they're getting a little spicy toward the end of the record there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I also want to make mention that I really love the vocal performance on this record. There is, it really adds to the atmosphere of this music, which is just so psychotically and convolutedly bloodthirsty. Yeah, you're getting eaten by a seventh dimensional being or something. But the vocals, like even those like probably inhaled growls, are delivered with so much heat and intensity behind them, and then doubled down with the really slurring gore grind stuff underneath it. It's almost always double tracked, and the tracks are slipping, across each other and occasionally getting together for big unison moments. I think that's really the fundamental thing that sets this record apart from so many other bands that are operating in a similar niche. Is just the rage in this music. A rage so profound and so intense it becomes sort of cold and meditative. And I don't know, there's a real sort of like spooky, dark energy that flows through this record for me. It's very, it takes a while to figure it out, but then it becomes very sort of uncomfortable to listen to.
All right, we return from chatting about how the death metal guy has been kicking ass and taking names this year to sink our collective teeth into the big, juicy hamburger that is All Heads Are Gonna Roll by Vomitory, out now on Metal Blade Records.
Fuck yeah.
So this is a band that I think we bonded over years ago when we were first hanging out, like, you know, more than 10 years ago. This was one of those things that I liked that was a sort of a respectable death metal deep cut, where you're like, oh, I like Vomitory, right?
Yeah. My chosen album was always Revelation Nausea. And, yeah, I think we did talk about that. It's just such a weird band for, like, you back then, as a much more precise and dedicated black metal listener, for you to be into Vomitory was a big surprise, you know?
Well, exactly. It was something that crossed over to your territory. So here, yeah, this gets us to the essence of the sound. Vomitory, over the years, is one of those bands that has always been sort of craftsman-like songwriting first approach. However, the basic template is highly original and distinctive and did something no one else was doing at the time, certainly. Which is, so I was mostly a black metal guy, but also, because I liked more minimalist, punk-rooted sounds, I also really liked Swedish death metal. Especially Grave, as you know.
Yeah.
And Vomitory had this sort of Grave and Dismember bulldozer effect, and it had a lot of D beats, but it also was about 50-50 with really heavy East Coast U.S. death metal, Florida and New York. And it was sort of, the aesthetics were less like the vintage gore aesthetics of Swedeath, and much more like the, less like vintage horror, and much more like modern, brutal death gore aesthetics. And the overall sound was kind of like that too. There was more technicality. There was a lot of blasting. There's a concerted focus on making like brutal down tempo or lower mid tempo sections, which you wouldn't have as much in the Swedish stuff back then. So maybe some 6/8 chug parts in Grave or whatever. It really felt more like, I always thought like, oh, I like black metal and old school death metal, right? This Vomitory was rooted in the old school Swedish stuff, but it felt like very modern death metal, and modern death metal has been shaped by USDM above all else.
Yeah, I think Vomitory exists in kind of a weird space where clearly this is at its root a Swedish death metal band, but it's the overall presentation of Vomitory is rounded off with so much information from just about everywhere, as well as a lot of stuff from the Swedish scene that is not traditional Swedeath. There's a surprising streak of like melodic death metal that dots a lot of their music. But it's tempered by more brutal and dissonant stuff, because these guys clearly listen to death grind and brutal death metal. It's like you can hear parts that are like kind of like Rotten Sound occasionally, which is another band, another Swedish band that kind of owes a lot of its like primordial character to original Swedeath. Well, the immediate thing that I want to compare it to, just because we
Rotten Sound are Finnish.
Oh, they're Finnish? Oh, my bad. Okay, for some reason I thought they were Swedish.
You might have been thinking of You're like, Nazem is Swedish.
Yeah, Nazem is Swedish. The real thing that I want to compare it to that we've covered on the show, though, is the Defleshed record that we covered. Defleshed are country mates in Sweden. They have about the same amount of history as Vomitory. They formed just like 2 years apart from each other. And they play a very similar style of polished but very aggressive death with a lot of thrash and grind involved also. And I would say the experience of listening to this record is actually, it's very similar to the experience of listening to Grind Over Matter by that band.
Yeah, Defleshed is more consistently focused on blast beats and up-tempo, and I think is also, we remembered on that record there was a lot of thrash that we maybe hadn't been expecting. This record also sounds thrashier than anything else I've heard from Vomitory, but it's a lot less thrashy than the Defleshed. But yeah, I agree, sort of high contrast, blast and D-beat, straightforward songs oriented towards being just good, really good death metal. You said something about you had a nice sort of poetic description of this in your notes. Listening to this album is like taking a guided tour through a well-curated but unpretentious record collection by true death metal maniacs who are entering middle age. Wise, composed, but with all the vigor of a pissed-off 19-year-old.
Yeah.
I was just reading what my co-host wrote, but it's really good.
Yeah, because I think that one thing that also links this to Defleshed is that, okay, these are guys with just a ton of history in this style, a very long career. We're at 30-plus years for each of those bands. But what makes them still relevant is that they still love being death metal. They love playing death metal. They've maintained that fire and enthusiasm for the genre that they had as people that had a big hand in shaping what it ended up being. And that's what makes listening to this just such a fun experience, because it's sort of down the middle, but not in a way that, is sanding off the edges. It's just so well-rounded from so many years and so much history that these guys have playing all these different styles of death metal. And that enthusiasm shines through in a big way. And it's nice to have one of these kinds of death metal records that's just kind of affirming. Because I think when we did the Defleshed review, I was talking about, it's like, I like being a metalhead. I think this shit is cool. I like all the classic things that these genres are made of, and so do these guys.
Yeah, so let's go to a sample.
Yeah, so let's go to the second track. Decrowned is really cool. I'm not sure if I'm projecting a little bit because we were talking about this record on Discord recently. Oh, by the way, we've got a Discord, $5 and up, yada yada. We skipped that, but you know the drill. A big influence on this record appears to be Domination by Morbid Angel, which is kind of a controversial record. It's definitely not one of my favorites, but the first half of it has some pretty cool ideas that Morbid Angel didn't really revisit too much later, but it seems like Vomitory has really picked up and run with. There's something especially about the execution of vocal rhythms against the blast beats that really remind me of tracks like, Eyes to See, Ears to Hear. But then we're going to start with a pretty cool Morbid Angel part, but Morbid Angel would never drop into just like a totally retarded D-beat section, but Vomitory are willing to do that.
Ugh.
Yes, it's so much fun. And I was like, I realized at the end there when the DB part dropped, it's like, I don't know why I was thinking of a DB part. It's just it's a Slayer riff.
Mm-hmm.
It's totally a Slayer riff. But everything leading up to that point is pretty much like direct from like mid-era Morbid Angel, like Domination, or you pointed out Covenant. These like single string trem riffs are really fucking good, and it's hard to make single string death metal trem riffs that are that good anymore, because we've used pretty much all the notes at this point.
Yeah, so what is the thing? Yeah, so the first one you were like, that's a really good riff, because it's just a very basic, fundamental death metal riff.
Yeah, it's I loved because it's almost like a slowed down version of a deranged riff, where it's it's all about that octave bounce there, that string skipping octave bounce, which just naturally builds so much tension, because that's like that octave bounce is like the main riff on Sarcophago's Inri. That don da don da da don da don da don, like an primordial extreme metal riff. But these guys use that sort of motif over and over across this record. And they infuse it with some of that sort of like, I don't know, like a vague kind of gothic cathedral energy that is really like specific to the Swedish bands. I think these guys blend the Swedish and American stuff better than almost anybody, just in terms of like how cleanly all these things fit together.
Yeah, so that kind of like, those kinds of riffs, the more gothic sounding ones, those sound like, there's a whole class of riff on Covenant, which is a record I like a lot, where
that's my favorite, actually.
Yeah, there are really Swedish sounding melodic riffs there. It's a little bit tricky because the Swedes were really influenced by Morbid Angel. And I don't mean Swedeath, I mean Black Death. I mean stuff that sounds like Dissection, Necrophobic, Sacramentum and Dawn, right? And early this is the thing, the stuff that would come before it would have been like the very, like, Sentenced in Finland, or like maybe demos by Dissection, or maybe the first At the Gates record. So there's some sort of sound that is in both Morbid Angel and Sweden at almost exactly the same time that is the beginning of this kind of more ornate gothic kind of melodic style, and they nail that here. And then the song structure here is something like ABC, ABD, right? There's the first blasting section, which is really like grind, and then that sets up a second blasting section where we were both like, oh yeah, this riff rips, right?
Yeah,
dude.
And
that's two sort of whiplashing leads that are stepped into disharmony with each other. So there's a really cool sort of wailing drone sound, and you agree that sounds like Marduk, especially like the really, really nasty tracks on the end of Panzer Division where it gets a little more epic.
Yeah. Well, as soon as they throw that big like octave harmony over it, it's like, oh yeah. And it's like we were talking while I was playing. It's like Marduk is, the first Marduk record is essentially a death metal record, and death metal has always been like a really important part of their sound. It's one of the reasons Panzer Division sounds like it does. So it makes sense that it's less a death or a black metal idea, and maybe it's just more a Swedish extreme metal idea.
Yeah, grinding Swedish extreme metal. Yeah. Well, we've also talked about how a lot of, like, say, the Swedish Black Death stuff, it's not really... It's, like, spiritually black metal, but its roots are pretty different from the Norwegian stuff.
Yeah.
Although that's tricky, because Marduk sounded more like a Norwegian band, but, there's... I agree with what you're saying. This is like a quintessentially Swedish. Like, what goes into a Vomitory record is less like, is it death metal, and more like, is it Swedish?
Yeah, no, that's accurate. And there's of course, just limitless cross-pollination between these ideas. I remember when we did that Terminus Prime episode where you heard Altars of Madness for the first time, and you pointed out how Trey Azagtote in 1989 basically just invents the Swedish melodic Black Death riff on Suffocation just as like a little like a little interim bridge riff, and then he just moves on and never revisits it again.
Yeah, like a little throwaway. Right, so I think a lot of those riffs really, I think some of those Swedish riffs really were just coming from Morbid Angel.
Yeah, it definitely, it makes sense hearing that in the context here. It's like, it really makes those ideas fit together in a way that I'd never really considered before. So, staying with the Swedish theme, let me go to my other sample. This song is titled Raped, Strangled, Sodomized, Dead, which is great. I love the, like, hard edge to this stuff, you know? I'm glad that it's not, like, softened with time. Now, this song sounds radically different from what you might expect, but sticking with the Swedish theme, this is a track that moves more in the melodic direction compared to a lot of the grindier tracks on this. And like,
this is the love song.
That's true. This is a ballad, so it's only fair. So this, I mean, let's just listen to this from the very beginning. I'll say it. This track begins with a really cool Monomarth riff. So, you agreed immediately that opening riff is just like a One Cent from the Golden Hall riff.
Yeah, and then once they go to that tom strut,
yeah,
it's still like an Monomarth song.
Yeah, and then they get into the main verse riff, which is different. But yeah, I like that they're not leaving that on the table. And everyone's probably tired of hearing me gush about the first Monomarth record, but again, it's such a touchstone for so many things, and it's never really been replicated. I love the weird juxtaposition between different things in this band. I love that when they get to the chorus where he screams raped, strangled, sodomized, dead, it's over that intro Monomarth riff. You know, it's like, I love the juxtaposition of the more extreme sort of vicious American death metal attitude, but just applied to this much more melodic and considered European style. Which is also something that channels another band that we talked about in the Defleshed review, which is The Crown, which is another phenomenal band. Is this a whole style unto itself? Like Defleshed, Vomitory, The Crown, sort of like thrashy but still extreme Swedish death metal that pulls from America?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would have not put... The Vomitory Defleshed thing makes sense to me instantly. The Crown... The Crown is so much more focused on the rock and roll and melodeath aspects of it that I feel like it's a bit different.
I think it's just like I get a similar energy from the two because these are all party records, you know.
Well, here's another thing. It might be that One thing is that this record sounds more like Defleshed and The Crown. There's a lot of more melodic riffs on it, and the production is pulled back. So it emphasizes a thrashiness, which is, of course, also, Melodeath is thrash metal, right? Mm-hmm. It emphasizes that side of the music more. If there's one note of criticism I'd have about this album, it's that, like, one thing that to me would distinguish Vomitory from a band like The Crown is, A, brute physicality, B, the production, a guitar tone that goes with that. And this record's guitar tone is a little bit more, it's good, but it's just like good, and it sounds much more like a modern thrash production.
I actually really like the production here, just because it's like, yes, this is a party record, this is big metal blade, I'm cool with it,
Yeah, but the older stuff used to deliver as party music, but very uncomfortable party music.
Yeah, that's fair.
It used to be more, this is less brutal than their old stuff. I think I can say that definitely. And compare that to something like the one I listened to a lot back in the day was Carnage Euphoria. I tried to figure out what the difference in tone was, and I would have thought, surely it was heavier and a kind of suffocation-y way, or in the way that or in sort of really modern brick-walled tone or something like that. And I went back and listened to it. It actually sounds like the most crushing D-beat.
Okay.
It has a guitar tone that has some space in it. So there's it may be that there's actual bulldozer bass going on, but in the riffs, right, which it could be the combination of guitars and bass, there's a pretty clear tonal center, and then a bunch of overdriven fuzz noise bellying out from it. And that sounds a lot more like, Crude SS or something than a death metal band. Or Kuro from Japan, or also just like Discharge, except downtuned. And that's an interesting thing. So you think playing downtuned blasting death metal with a tone like that is just going to sound disgusting. And this record doesn't quite have that disgustingness to it. However, the songwriting that I really liked about that old stuff, that sort of D-beat rooted, most extreme side of Sweet Oath songwriting, that's still here.
Yeah, definitely.
So, that's what my sample's focused on. So, the death metal guy has highlighted some really cool sort of Morbid Angel influence, some blast beats, some elaborate harmonized Black Death guitar. Now let's listen to Dead Man Stalking. Well, I gotta say, I definitely didn't realize I had sampled a full 3 minutes of that.
Well, it all flows so well.
Exactly. It's all really good. So let's talk about, we got pretty far into the development of it, which was interesting, but at the very beginning, right, you get,
Yeah.
That is, that's a wonderful, crushing Swedish death metal riff. And there's something interesting going on there. So, first of all, we always talk on the show about what makes a good D-beat riff, right? Mm-hmm. You can hear it there, right?
Oh, well, I was going to say, it's a great Sweet Death riff. It's also just a completely, on its face, plausible Dark Crust riff to me. Well, maybe those are the same thing. Maybe the ideal Swedish death metal riff is just a crust riff.
Yes, the ideal Swedish death metal riff sounds a lot more like its hardcore influences than the bands that are... This is something we've talked about. Neither of us is super... I mean, Vomitory will kill us for saying this, but neither of us are super into Entombed, right?
Yeah.
Or, we both like the first Dismember record for being, a better version of that, but the things that make it stand out, really, are the more melodic riffs and things like that. Or the big flair and drama, right?
Or at least that's what people have come to understand Sweet Death as.
Right, and so, those bands have a way of doing the D-beat riffs where there's a lot of thrashy jugga under them, and it's so fast and technical for the time that it can kind of obscure the shape of the riff. Whereas this is a big, blocky power chord riff in the style of maybe... You could trace it back to Nihilist, but also more immediately to Grave. And there's something weird going on. Grave actually, on Into the Grave at least, did not use D-beats. They used Slayer beats, just 1-2 Slayer beats, which, also in hardcore, and used to write a very similar, upbeat, syncopated style of riff, right? All over the Misfits, the later Misfits stuff. But, Grave didn't use D-beats, but sounded closer to an authentic crust band than any of the other major fully formed Swedish death metal stuff. And, the Grave stuff has the same tendency to just sit on the most crushing intervals possible. The move up to a fifth and then the drop down a tritone, I think it is a really Grave thing. The sort of emphasis on, you go to, in the classic, we call it thrash metal minor scale or whatever.
Yeah.
You go to the nastiest parts, like the major third, which is really just the sort of the half-step slide above the minor third, right? You sit on that and on the fifth in ways that really grind against the other intervals. There's no fancy rhythmic shit going on there. It just moves through full measures or half measures, but it has a very cool melodic shape to it as it develops. It's a good example of fewer notes, clearer form.
Yeah, I was actually thinking while it was playing, there's certain records from the Razorback catalog that I'm going to recommend to you now, because if you're into that, those sort of odd gothic D-beat riffs in a death metal context, there's some records out there that are really good that would appeal directly to that sensibility.
Okay, well, so what is here's another thing about that. What was I going to say? The other things you could link it to would be stuff that actually were contemporaries of Vomitory. So, the very earliest Sweet Death revival bands, right? Vomitory was not a revival band. They started in 92, which is they got their first demo out in 92, which was a little bit late by those standards, right? But we don't have a full length till 96. I assume they were literal young teenagers until then. So they start a little bit later, but they're basically a classic canonical band that's around for the revival. But they're contemporary with, say, Death Breath, right? Which is the better version of Entombed, and Bastard Priest. And those bands also had similar kind of, they refocused on the sort of elementary stuff of the riff. Also the answering riff, that more thrashing, crisp, great. And then you really noticed how good a lot of the development stuff after that was, where they really slowed it down, and you linked it to Slayer.
Yeah, listening to this again, Slayer's really dotted all over this record. I mean, as it is for every extreme metal band in a sense, but
yeah, sure.
Specifically, we want to pare that down to like South of Heaven and Seasons in the Abyss seem to be really big touchstones here. Because Vomitory generally doesn't go like super fast, like Rain and Blood fast. It seems like the band is mostly interested in operating around these like mid-fast tempos, and there's a lot of that on those two records, which are notoriously the ones where Slayer, by their standards, slows it way down. But yeah, something about the way some of the punkiest riffs on this are composed remind me of sort of the hardcore underpinnings of Slayer that would come out in certain riff shapes.
Especially on those post-Rain and Blood records.
Yeah.
I think brought that out. And, so those are, hardcore, modern hardcore as we know it, like metalcore or beatdown, was in its infancy then. So really the Slayer breakdowns on South of Heaven or on Seasons in the Abyss are actually some of the very first examples of that.
Yeah, it's always interesting when we dig into like the sequencing of metal versus hardcore, and things are located at very different years from where we expect them.
Yeah. Honestly, even that answering riff on the D beat section, that's like a Slayer riff too.
Yeah. Yeah, there's Slayer all over this fucking thing.
Yeah. Yeah, they just slew all over the place.
Is that like gooning? I hope it's not like gooning.
So, last, last sample is equally focused on the more dissonant D-beat aspects of the record. However, this one is a little bit fancier in terms of how the riffing is implemented, and there's a kind of development that goes on, but more towards something that's almost like sky, ready for So as we were finishing that sample, I told the death metal guy, yeah, let's run it a little longer, get more of that doom. And then I remembered why I stopped it there, because it just goes back into but the double, it goes back into the double pedal stuff. It's not a Motorhead beat, it's downbeat double pedal. It goes back into that, and it just incorporates the sort of grotesque gothic harmony from the doom riff.
Yeah.
Which is exactly like a thing that happened on your sample, right? You were like, at the end of Raped, Strangled, Sodomized, Dead, I think, or at the end of one of those samples, you were like, oh, let's run it a little longer. And then you're like, oh, no, that's why I cut it.
Yeah. But no, that's also, what's interesting is once they overlay that sort of, like, gothic doom thing over the top of it, you end up with the combined voicings that are like Morbid Angel chord voicings. Like there's like a specific sort of weird chord that Asymptote likes to use in a lot of his riff constructions, and they're like landing on a bunch of them right there. It's interesting. I really like what we've been seeing lately coming out of like Metal Blade and some of the bigger labels where they're going to bat for death metal that is accessible and is listenable, but is still fundamentally death metal and extreme, and can't be mistaken for any other kind of music. Like the Defleshed was a great example. This is a great example. Different style, but a similar ethos. The 200 Stab Wounds record that... Well, actually, no, they didn't put out the first one, but they're putting out follow-up records now that they're on Metal Blade. I think it's really good to see. I think that, insofar as anything like mainstream death metal can exist, I like that more and more of it sounding like this.
I hope Satan has a nice colon, because that's where you're going to be living.
System,
bloodthirsty cadaver junkie can't touch us as long as we're not stupid enough to leave this building.